Vanessa Blake moved through the corporate world with a precision that few could detect and even fewer could counter. Her public persona radiated charm and competence, the sort of polished confidence that made investors, board members, and media observers alike believe she was merely the professional partner of Lucas Whitmore, dedicated to the growth of his empire. Yet beneath the surface, her motives were far more calculated. Each smile, each gesture, each strategically timed laugh at Evelyn's discomfort was meticulously designed to signal dominance without overt aggression. Vanessa understood that the most effective power is invisible, psychological, and insidious. By occupying Lucas's attention both publicly and professionally, she effectively rewrote the narrative around the Whitmore legacy, transforming herself from a secondary figure into the symbol of the empire's future. Her influence over investor perception was subtle but pervasive. She would position herself at the right tables during key negotiations, contribute ideas that seemed generous and forward-thinking, and then skillfully allow Lucas to take credit, ensuring that both his confidence and reliance on her grew simultaneously. Every observer in the boardroom or gala setting, every glance that investors recorded, reinforced the perception that Vanessa was indispensable. Evelyn, from the margins of these orchestrated displays, began to notice the pattern. The laughter Vanessa allowed herself at her expense was not spontaneous amusement. It was a carefully rehearsed psychological weapon designed to remind everyone, especially Evelyn, that she controlled the emotional and social rhythm of every encounter. Vanessa's mastery of optics extended beyond social perception. She exploited legal loopholes and structural vulnerabilities within the corporate hierarchy to diminish Evelyn's influence quietly but effectively. Emails left unacknowledged, minor operational decisions rerouted through channels that bypassed Evelyn, and subtle amendments in trust and inheritance documents all contributed to a systematic reduction of Evelyn's control. The strategies were executed with surgical precision, leaving no overt trace of wrongdoing while eroding confidence and authority incrementally. Lucas's silence in these scenarios further strengthened Vanessa's position. His inaction, whether intentional or negligent, communicated to investors, staff, and Evelyn herself that Vanessa's actions were acceptable and even endorsed. Every time Evelyn attempted to assert her presence, she encountered structural resistance or passive indifference, a reminder that influence in this world was not determined by morality or marriage, but by perception, strategy, and control of information. The imbalance became undeniable as Evelyn cataloged Vanessa's maneuvers mentally. She tracked patterns of attention, the precise moments when Vanessa would interject at meetings, redirect conversations, or subtly emphasize Evelyn's absence. These observations revealed not only Vanessa's competence but also the fragility of Lucas's own judgment. Wealth, influence, and public perception, which had once seemed aligned with Evelyn's security, now tilted decisively in Vanessa's favor. Each victory Vanessa achieved was invisible to the public yet deeply consequential, consolidating her control over the empire without requiring confrontation. Evelyn, though initially shaken by the elegance of the betrayal, began to approach the situation with analytical clarity. She recognized that Vanessa's strategy was not random. It was methodical, iterative, and designed to anticipate counteraction. Every move was layered with contingencies, designed to protect her position while advancing her claim to authority over both corporate assets and the unborn child's potential inheritance. Evelyn also understood that this psychological battlefield extended beyond corporate maneuvering. It penetrated personal space and identity. Vanessa's dominance created a scenario in which Evelyn's every hesitation or mistake would be magnified, her pregnancy framed as vulnerability, and her marital position reframed as optional. Yet, for all of Vanessa's careful planning, Evelyn began identifying cracks. Subtle overconfidence, reliance on Lucas's continued inaction, and occasional lapses in the precise timing of her gestures provided the first glimpses of potential leverage. Evelyn cataloged these weaknesses while maintaining the appearance of passivity, knowing that any overt counteraction at this stage could provoke defensive adaptation. In the broader context, Vanessa's game demonstrated a critical lesson. In environments governed by wealth and power, emotional attachments are irrelevant. What appeared to be affection or loyalty in her interactions with Lucas was nothing more than strategic alignment. Love was irrelevant, whereas influence was everything. Evelyn's analysis of this dynamic sharpened her own strategic thinking, forcing her to consider psychological, legal, and social factors simultaneously in planning her response. Vanessa's movements were not merely threats but opportunities. Each calculated gesture, each orchestrated social maneuver revealed vulnerabilities that, if approached with patience and insight, could be exploited. Evelyn began envisioning a comprehensive response that accounted for public perception, corporate structures, and the legal protections for her unborn child, understanding that timing and precision were essential. Every detail mattered. The positioning of Vanessa in photographs, her laughter at private moments amplified through social channels, her control of small decision-making processes, and Lucas's subtle yet consequential inaction. Each element was part of a larger system of influence and control that had been systematically designed to consolidate Vanessa's position. Evelyn's growing awareness transformed humiliation into tactical intelligence. Where others might see embarrassment, she identified leverage. Where others would see laughter, she detected strategy. The game had been laid bare in the quiet, relentless accumulation of small victories, and Evelyn now understood that survival and eventual reclamation of influence required mastering the same principles of psychological precision and strategic patience that Vanessa employed so effortlessly. While Vanessa continued her outward displays of charm and authority, she remained unaware of the meticulous attention Evelyn had devoted to tracking every nuance, every misstep, and every opportunity. The psychological duel, subtle and invisible to those around them, had already begun. The balance of power, though momentarily favoring Vanessa, was not immutable. Evelyn's observations, her mental catalog of weaknesses, and her strategic foresight set the stage for a reversal that would emerge only when her actions were most carefully timed. Evelyn discovers a hidden corporate document revealing Vanessa's explicit plan to seize complete control of the unborn child's future inheritance, exposing the true depth of her ambition and forcing Evelyn to prepare for a counterstrategy that could redefine the battle for the Whitmore legacy. Vanessa Blake moved through the corporate world with a precision that few could detect and even fewer could counter. Her public persona radiated charm and competence, the sort of polished confidence that made investors, board members, and media observers alike believe she was merely the professional partner of Lucas Whitmore, dedicated to the growth of his empire. Yet beneath the surface, her motives were far more calculated. Each smile, each gesture, each strategically timed laugh at Evelyn's discomfort was meticulously designed to signal dominance without overt aggression. Vanessa understood that the most effective power is invisible, psychological, and insidious. By occupying Lucas's attention both publicly and professionally, she effectively rewrote the narrative around the Whitmore legacy, transforming herself from a secondary figure into the symbol of the empire's future. Her influence over investor perception was subtle but pervasive. She would position herself at the right tables during key negotiations, contribute ideas that seemed generous and forward-thinking, and then skillfully allow Lucas to take credit, ensuring that both his confidence and reliance on her grew simultaneously. Every observer in the boardroom or gala setting, every glance that investors recorded, reinforced the perception that Vanessa was indispensable. Evelyn, from the margins of these orchestrated displays, began to notice the pattern. The laughter Vanessa allowed herself at her expense was not spontaneous amusement. It was a carefully rehearsed psychological weapon designed to remind everyone, especially Evelyn, that she controlled the emotional and social rhythm of every encounter. Vanessa's mastery of optics extended beyond social perception. She exploited legal loopholes and structural vulnerabilities within the corporate hierarchy to diminish Evelyn's influence quietly but effectively. Emails left unacknowledged, minor operational decisions rerouted through channels that bypassed Evelyn, and subtle amendments in trust and inheritance documents all contributed to a systematic reduction of Evelyn's control. The strategies were executed with surgical precision, leaving no overt trace of wrongdoing while eroding confidence and authority incrementally. Lucas's silence in these scenarios further strengthened Vanessa's position. His inaction, whether intentional or negligent, communicated to investors, staff, and Evelyn herself that Vanessa's actions were acceptable and even endorsed. Every time Evelyn attempted to assert her presence, she encountered structural resistance or passive indifference, a reminder that influence in this world was not determined by morality or marriage, but by perception, strategy, and control of information. The imbalance became undeniable as Evelyn cataloged Vanessa's maneuvers mentally. She tracked patterns of attention, the precise moments when Vanessa would interject at meetings, redirect conversations, or subtly emphasize Evelyn's absence. These observations revealed not only Vanessa's competence but also the fragility of Lucas's own judgment. Wealth, influence, and public perception, which had once seemed aligned with Evelyn's security, now tilted decisively in Vanessa's favor. Each victory Vanessa achieved was invisible to the public yet deeply consequential, consolidating her control over the empire without requiring confrontation. Evelyn, though initially shaken by the elegance of the betrayal, began to approach the situation with analytical clarity. She recognized that Vanessa's strategy was not random. It was methodical, iterative, and designed to anticipate counteraction. Every move was layered with contingencies, designed to protect her position while advancing her claim to authority over both corporate assets and the unborn child's potential inheritance. Evelyn also understood that this psychological battlefield extended beyond corporate maneuvering. It penetrated personal space and identity. Vanessa's dominance created a scenario in which Evelyn's every hesitation or mistake would be magnified, her pregnancy framed as vulnerability, and her marital position reframed as optional. Yet, for all of Vanessa's careful planning, Evelyn began identifying cracks. Subtle overconfidence, reliance on Lucas's continued inaction, and occasional lapses in the precise timing of her gestures provided the first glimpses of potential leverage. Evelyn cataloged these weaknesses while maintaining the appearance of passivity, knowing that any overt counteraction at this stage could provoke defensive adaptation. In the broader context, Vanessa's game demonstrated a critical lesson. In environments governed by wealth and power, emotional attachments are irrelevant. What appeared to be affection or loyalty in her interactions with Lucas was nothing more than strategic alignment. Love was irrelevant, whereas influence was everything. Evelyn's analysis of this dynamic sharpened her own strategic thinking, forcing her to consider psychological, legal, and social factors simultaneously in planning her response. Vanessa's movements were not merely threats but opportunities. Each calculated gesture, each orchestrated social maneuver revealed vulnerabilities that, if approached with patience and insight, could be exploited. Evelyn began envisioning a comprehensive response that accounted for public perception, corporate structures, and the legal protections for her unborn child, understanding that timing and precision were essential. Every detail mattered. The positioning of Vanessa in photographs, her laughter at private moments amplified through social channels, her control of small decision-making processes, and Lucas's subtle yet consequential inaction. Each element was part of a larger system of influence and control that had been systematically designed to consolidate Vanessa's position. Evelyn's growing awareness transformed humiliation into tactical intelligence. Where others might see embarrassment, she identified leverage. Where others would see laughter, she detected strategy. The game had been laid bare in the quiet, relentless accumulation of small victories, and Evelyn now understood that survival and eventual reclamation of influence required mastering the same principles of psychological precision and strategic patience that Vanessa employed so effortlessly. While Vanessa continued her outward displays of charm and authority, she remained unaware of the meticulous attention Evelyn had devoted to tracking every nuance, every misstep, and every opportunity. The psychological duel, subtle and invisible to those around them, had already begun. The balance of power, though momentarily favoring Vanessa, was not immutable. Evelyn's observations, her mental catalog of weaknesses, and her strategic foresight set the stage for a reversal that would emerge only when her actions were most carefully timed. Evelyn discovers a hidden corporate document revealing Vanessa's explicit plan to seize complete control of the unborn child's future inheritance, exposing the true depth of her ambition and forcing Evelyn to prepare for a counterstrategy that could redefine the battle for the Whitmore legacy. Beneath the glittering surface of Lucas Whitmore's empire, a web of deception and silent manipulation began to reveal itself, and Evelyn Carter, still adjusting to the humiliations of the previous gala, found herself staring at a reality far more dangerous than she had imagined. The layers of power within the corporation were not transparent, and the loyalty she had assumed existed among Lucas's top advisors was rapidly proving conditional and self-serving. Quiet meetings, ostensibly routine strategic discussions, masked alliances that favored Vanessa Blake at every turn, subtly signaling her as the inevitable successor to the Whitmore brand. Advisors who had once offered neutral or friendly guidance now acted as invisible agents of Vanessa's agenda, framing decisions and presenting options in ways that minimized Evelyn's influence and amplified her vulnerability. While the surface of the company projected stability, Evelyn quickly discovered that internal communications were riddled with discrepancies. Trust documents and financial transfers, once considered secure and predictable, contained subtle but critical alterations. Figures were shifted, clauses rewritten, and authorizations quietly rerouted, all designed to systematically erode her legal authority and reduce her potential leverage over assets connected to her unborn child. As Evelyn meticulously traced these adjustments, she began to perceive the broader pattern of betrayal, realizing that corporate insiders had developed a coordinated strategy to reshape the Whitmore empire without her consent. Whispers circulated in boardrooms and executive lounges, conversations too muted for outsiders to notice but sharp enough to carry warnings. Assets were being reallocated, investments shifted, and critical decisions made under the assumption that Evelyn's input would be either irrelevant or overridden. Each subtle maneuver was a reminder that public appearances were deceptive, that what appeared benign or ordinary often concealed carefully executed strategic moves designed to isolate her from influence. Vanessa's public demeanor, professional and courteous, masked an ongoing campaign that, while invisible to the media and shareholders, was devastating in its cumulative effect. The legal and financial frameworks that Evelyn had trusted as immutable safeguards were, in truth, malleable tools wielded against her, and the isolation this created was both psychological and operational. She found herself navigating a landscape where allies were scarce, and even those who appeared supportive might be compromised or incentivized to remain passive. The challenge extended beyond the immediate power struggle with Vanessa. It required a thorough understanding of the hidden architecture of the company, its legal frameworks, and the subtle interpersonal dynamics that defined loyalty and influence at the executive level. Evelyn began methodically tracing leaks and cross-referencing communications, noting patterns that revealed where information had been intentionally diverted or manipulated. Every misrouted email, every delayed briefing, every carefully worded report became a data point in a growing map of betrayal, a web she needed to untangle to protect herself and her unborn child. The realization that Lucas's advisors were not neutral but actively complicit in Vanessa's consolidation of power sent a chill through her. Even proximity to Lucas, once a perceived shield, offered no immunity against the deliberate restructuring of influence within the organization. Each layer of corporate deception exposed not just the fragility of her standing, but also the calculated nature of Vanessa's manipulations, demonstrating that the battle for control of the Whitmore legacy was legal, strategic, and psychological, rather than physical. Evelyn's investigative process became an exercise in precision. She reviewed board meeting notes, financial transactions, and trust documents, noting where the language had been modified to favor Vanessa and where procedural norms had been bent to circumvent her authority. The subtlety of these alterations meant that any hasty reaction could backfire, providing Vanessa with a pretext to claim impropriety or discredit Evelyn publicly. Consequently, Evelyn approached the unraveling of the betrayal with patience, recognizing that her own composure was both a tool of resistance and a strategic necessity. As she mapped out the network of deception, she began to identify patterns of behavior among board members, advisors, and mid-level executives. Certain individuals, previously thought neutral or loyal, displayed tendencies toward alignment with Vanessa's agenda, revealing a combination of personal ambition, calculated self-preservation, and financial incentive. Evelyn also discovered that the timing of financial reallocations and trust amendments was synchronized with events designed to humiliate her publicly, a revelation that confirmed the depth of the conspiracy. The complexity of the betrayal left Evelyn with little margin for error. Any misstep could result in irreversible consequences for both her authority and the security of her unborn child's inheritance. She realized that corporate loyalty was transactional, and that the subtle engineering of influence could be far more damaging than any overt confrontation. Evelyn's understanding of this new landscape transformed her perspective. While Vanessa had believed that her careful orchestration of power and perception guaranteed dominance, Evelyn recognized that knowledge, foresight, and methodical planning could neutralize even the most intricate campaigns. Her awareness of the systemic nature of the betrayal allowed her to anticipate moves and identify vulnerabilities that Vanessa had overlooked. In this environment, trust had become a currency more valuable than any asset, and Evelyn began cultivating covert channels of intelligence, quietly reinforcing her position while continuing to observe and document every nuance of the corporate chessboard. Each revelation strengthened her resolve. The humiliation she had endured was merely the opening act in a far larger strategic contest, one that required both patience and precision. By meticulously cataloging the actors, incentives, and procedural loopholes, Evelyn began constructing a response that would not only defend her position but ultimately reclaim authority over assets, influence, and the future of her family's legacy. Every layer of deception she unraveled illuminated the stakes of the conflict and underscored the necessity of careful, deliberate action in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Evelyn understood that the corporate world, as much as it resembled the social arenas she had navigated in public life, operated under rules defined by information control, perception management, and the strategic exploitation of trust. The betrayal, while deeply personal, was also systemic, revealing the sophistication of Vanessa's campaign and the complicity of those who had once seemed allies. Each discovery, each confirmation of manipulation, reinforced the urgency of action and the critical importance of timing in her response. Evelyn's mind, honed by both experience and instinct, began to chart the pathways necessary to reclaim agency and authority, transforming the shock of betrayal into the fuel for strategic clarity. As Evelyn compiled her evidence, she realized that a key board member had been bribed to support Vanessa's agenda, making any legal counterattack increasingly complex and forcing her to reconsider the timing and method of her next move. Knowing that a single misstep could jeopardize everything she had left, Evelyn Carter had entered a stage of her life where her greatest strength, the life growing within her, was simultaneously her most exploited vulnerability. The corporate world she had once navigated with confidence and poise now seemed a treacherous arena in which every maneuver by Vanessa Blake was calibrated to exploit her pregnancy and magnify her apparent fragility. As Evelyn pored over the latest trust documents and financial reports, she began to notice that structures she had once assumed were secure had been subtly altered. Assets earmarked for her and her unborn child's inheritance were reallocated in ways that diminished her authority while strengthening Vanessa's leverage. The modifications were not overt, and they were designed to be invisible to the casual observer. Yet Evelyn, with her keen attention to detail, detected the shifts immediately. She realized that Vanessa had recognized the power inherent in the unborn child's status and was wielding it like a strategic weapon, transforming a deeply personal and emotional connection into a pressure point that could be manipulated to force compliance. Evelyn felt the weight of this manipulation acutely, understanding that each corporate maneuver, each alteration to the trust, was intended to bend her will without the need for confrontation. Her pregnancy, which should have been a source of joy and anticipation, had become a lens through which every threat was magnified, every decision scrutinized, and every moment of indecision amplified. The psychological warfare was relentless. Evelyn sensed eyes upon her at all times, whether from board members, advisors, or Vanessa's carefully placed allies, creating a constant sensation of surveillance and evaluation. Each email she opened, each corporate briefing she attended, carried hidden significance, a reminder that she was being measured, judged, and tested for compliance. The constant observation was exhausting, but it also sharpened her resolve. She began to formulate strategies to counteract the imbalance of power, carefully balancing the need to protect her unborn child with the necessity of maintaining her credibility and agency within the company. Every decision became a matter of precision, and Evelyn meticulously planned her actions, identifying vulnerabilities in Vanessa's strategy that could be exploited without jeopardizing her child's security. The stakes were intensely personal, yet deeply intertwined with the larger battle for control over the Whitmore legacy. Evelyn realized that the dynamics surrounding her pregnancy had introduced a new dimension to the conflict. Her physical vulnerability added urgency and pressure, forcing her to act with both caution and immediacy. Unlike the public humiliation she had endured or the corporate betrayals she had unraveled, This threat was intimately tied to her sense of maternal responsibility. Vanessa's manipulation of these circumstances was calculated to generate compliance, yet Evelyn refused to yield to fear alone. She transformed the emotional weight into strategic clarity, allowing her to anticipate the adversary's moves and prepare countermeasures that were both subtle and effective. Evelyn began to map the chain of influence surrounding her child, tracing who controlled legal, financial, and operational levers that could affect the future of the Whitmore inheritance. She studied trust structures with painstaking detail, noting clauses that could be challenged and identifying redundancies that could be exploited to her advantage. The realization that Vanessa's advantage was not absolute gave Evelyn the confidence to plan a response that relied on precision rather than confrontation, knowledge rather than force. Each small discovery reinforced her determination. She understood that the psychological environment had been meticulously crafted to heighten her sense of isolation and powerlessness, yet her awareness of this design provided her with a tactical edge. By identifying patterns of surveillance, manipulation, and procedural exploitation, she could anticipate Vanessa's actions and prepare interventions that would disrupt the intended effect. Evelyn's strategy extended beyond simple counteraction. It involved creating an environment in which her decisions would remain autonomous, protected from the subtle encroachments Vanessa had already begun implementing. Every adjustment to trust documents, every subtle reallocation of financial authority, was now a challenge she was prepared to meet with foresight, ingenuity, and precision. The pregnancy, once seen as a vulnerability, became a motivator for innovation and strategic thinking, sharpening her focus and accelerating her capacity to respond to threats without revealing her full hand. Evelyn also recognized that maintaining composure was critical. Any display of fear, stress, or hesitation could be interpreted as weakness, emboldening Vanessa further and signaling to the corporate network that Evelyn was susceptible to manipulation. The emotional intensity of her circumstances, instead of being a source of despair, became the engine for her strategic clarity. She maintained a careful balance between outward calm and inward analysis, ensuring that each interaction, decision, and observation contributed to a growing framework for reclaiming authority. As she traced communication channels and legal structures, Evelyn began uncovering patterns of deliberate obstruction and subtle intimidation. Advisors and board members, whether knowingly or unknowingly, had been co-opted into supporting Vanessa's objectives, leaving Evelyn to navigate an environment in which even routine corporate interactions were fraught with hidden significance. Her awareness of these dynamics allowed her to anticipate threats and counteract them before they fully manifested, a process that demanded both patience and precision. Evelyn's approach was methodical, focused on incremental victories that would secure both her position and the safety of her unborn child. Each carefully considered move was a step toward dismantling the influence that Vanessa had accumulated while maintaining the integrity of legal and financial protections. She identified weaknesses in Vanessa's control of information and capitalized on these gaps through discreet inquiries, legal reviews, and strategic observation, ensuring that her next actions would be both informed and impactful. The heightened stakes of her pregnancy forced Evelyn to operate at a level of strategic rigor she had never previously required, blending foresight, psychological insight, and legal acumen. Each revelation, each subtle discovery, reinforced the need for patience, timing, and calculated action. Evelyn's growing understanding of Vanessa's methods, combined with her own meticulous planning, established a foundation for reclaiming influence over both her own life and the legacy her child would inherit. She knew that any misstep could have serious consequences, but the clarity with which she now understood the network of power allowed her to move with confidence, turning a situation of imposed vulnerability into an opportunity for strategic mastery. Every moment, every decision, and every observation contributed to a carefully structured framework for reclaiming agency, ensuring that the unborn child's security would remain uncompromised and that Evelyn could navigate the treacherous landscape of corporate betrayal with precision, foresight, and resilience. Just as Evelyn began to implement her carefully devised counter-strategies, a sudden internal audit revealed unauthorized changes to the Whitmore Trust, exposing immediate and direct threats to her unborn child's security and forcing her to confront a level of danger she had not yet anticipated. Evelyn Carter had come to understand that in the corridors of corporate power, Loyalty was seldom absolute and often masked by self-interest. The humiliations she had endured and the manipulations she had uncovered revealed a world where friends could betray with quiet precision, and perceived enemies could become unexpected sources of support. With the alterations to the Whitmore Trust and the subtle reallocation of assets now weighing heavily on her mind, she began systematically approaching corporate contacts she had previously trusted, seeking to uncover hidden sources of influence and support. Each interaction was a delicate negotiation, where casual politeness masked the probing questions that sought to distinguish those who would act out of principle from those motivated solely by ambition. Evelyn quickly realized that some individuals, while outwardly friendly, had aligned themselves with Vanessa Blake, drawn to the promise of future advancement, increased financial opportunity, or social prestige. These allies concealed their true intentions beneath layers of false loyalty, offering assistance or advice that was superficially helpful but ultimately designed to further Vanessa's control and erode Evelyn's position. Observing these dynamics sharpened Evelyn's analytical skills, forcing her to consider not only the overt messages conveyed by colleagues, but also the subtleties of timing, hesitation, and word choice that revealed unspoken loyalties. While many connections proved compromised, Evelyn's perseverance yielded an unexpected ally, someone who had maintained a quiet presence within the corporate structure and had access to information Vanessa assumed she could control exclusively. This individual provided critical insights into the structure of Vanessa's network, exposing patterns of influence, undisclosed agreements, and informal channels of authority that had allowed Vanessa to consolidate power with near invisibility. The information illuminated how Vanessa had orchestrated seemingly minor operational decisions, legal interpretations, and financial transfers to systematically weaken Evelyn's position without triggering overt scrutiny from Lucas or the board. Armed with this knowledge, Evelyn recognized that trust itself had become an invaluable currency, surpassing both wealth and rank within the company. Relationships once considered ancillary now represented potential leverage points, while misjudging loyalty could imperil her carefully constructed counterstrategies. She became increasingly meticulous in cataloging allies and adversaries, noting not only their public behaviors but also subtle indicators of influence, inclination, and alignment. Each discovery compelled Evelyn to recalibrate her approach, balancing caution with decisiveness, ensuring that she neither exposed vulnerabilities prematurely nor wasted opportunities to reclaim authority. The psychological stakes of this environment intensified as Evelyn realized that even her most careful measures were observed and interpreted through layers of corporate scrutiny. She adopted a disciplined approach to communication, choosing words, gestures, and timing with precision to convey strength while masking her tactical awareness. The unexpected ally continued to provide insights into the hidden corridors of power, revealing connections between Vanessa and select board members whose loyalties could be leveraged or challenged. These revelations allowed Evelyn to anticipate potential betrayals before they materialized, creating a framework of defensive and offensive strategies that balanced legal protections, public perception, and internal influence. Evelyn also recognized that the balance of power was fragile and subject to rapid shifts. A single misjudgment, whether entrusting an ally or confronting an adversary prematurely, could result in immediate and consequential setbacks. This understanding drove her to cultivate patience, observation, and strategic foresight, ensuring that every action was informed by comprehensive intelligence rather than reactionary impulse. As she traced these networks, Evelyn began identifying subtle patterns of interaction. Meetings scheduled under the guise of routine discussions, memos circulated with selective emphasis, and informal advisories intended to signal alignment with Vanessa's objectives. Each instance of coordination represented a micro-level shift in influence, a tactical maneuver designed to maintain Vanessa's dominance while keeping Evelyn at a perceived disadvantage. The cumulative effect of these interactions underscored the sophistication of the challenge she faced. Loyalty, once considered a given in her professional sphere, had been weaponized. Evelyn's ability to navigate these complexities required not only legal and corporate insight, but also a keen psychological understanding of human motivations, fears, and ambitions. In response, she refined her strategic approach, integrating intelligence gathering with careful cultivation of allies, timing interventions to coincide with vulnerabilities in Vanessa's network, and anticipating potential countermeasures that might emerge from both predictable and hidden adversaries. The environment demanded constant vigilance. Evelyn could not rely solely on existing structures or public perception. She needed to monitor the subtle ebb and flow of influence, recognizing that even minor lapses could compromise her position or, more critically, jeopardize the security of her unborn child's inheritance. As the network of masked loyalties became clearer, Evelyn identified several pivotal moments where intervention could disrupt Vanessa's consolidation of power. Carefully orchestrated inquiries, private communications, and strategically timed disclosures became tools to test allegiances, assess the reliability of potential allies, and fortify her own position. Each action, while measured and subtle, incrementally shifted the balance, allowing Evelyn to regain authority without provoking immediate confrontation. The psychological intensity of these maneuvers was amplified by the dual pressures of public scrutiny and personal stakes. Evelyn's pregnancy and the associated vulnerability introduced urgency, while the corporate environment demanded meticulous planning, discretion, and strategic precision. Navigating these intersecting pressures required resilience, focus, and an ability to convert emotional weight into actionable intelligence. Over time, Evelyn developed an acute sense of timing, recognizing the importance of sequencing decisions, disclosures, and interventions in ways that maximized effect while minimizing exposure. Each revelation regarding hidden loyalties or veiled allegiances informed her broader strategy, allowing her to anticipate Vanessa's moves, influence potential board decisions, and secure support from individuals whose motivations were aligned with principle rather than ambition. By cultivating this combination of observation, discretion, and tactical intervention, Evelyn gradually transformed her position from one of vulnerability to one of informed agency. Every step she took was designed to build leverage, mitigate risk, and prepare for eventual reclaiming of control over assets, influence, and the narrative surrounding the Whitmore legacy. Through this meticulous approach, Evelyn reinforced the principle that in a high-stakes environment, knowledge, insight, and timing were more decisive than force or confrontation. Even those who appeared loyal to Vanessa could be evaluated, their inclinations understood, and their utility incorporated into a strategic framework that protected her interests while exposing weaknesses in the adversary's position. Evelyn's growing understanding of masked loyalties reshaped her perception of the battle she faced. While the public saw a quiet, composed pregnant woman navigating corporate obligations, behind the scenes she operated with precision, acuity, and a strategic awareness that transformed each potential threat into an opportunity. The interplay between ally and adversary became a chessboard, each piece measured and maneuvered with intent. Evelyn uncovers a clandestine meeting scheduled between Vanessa and Lucas's investors, a convergence that could strip her of both public credibility and legal rights, forcing her to prepare for a decisive intervention that might redefine the unfolding struggle for control over the Whitmore empire. The humiliation Evelyn Carter had endured did more than wound her pride. It ignited a determination that transformed her from a passive observer into a calculated strategist, quietly orchestrating a counteroffensive that would unsettle the carefully constructed dominance of Vanessa Blake. Having meticulously analyzed the structures and systems previously used to diminish her influence, Evelyn recognized that the very corporate channels leveraged against her could be repurposed as instruments of empowerment. Each board meeting, internal memo, and procedural loophole that Vanessa had manipulated became an opportunity for Evelyn to assert control, not through overt confrontation but through the deliberate, precise use of intelligence and influence. She began systematically collecting evidence, compiling documentation that revealed the subtle manipulations Vanessa had executed across trust arrangements, financial reallocations, and executive communications. Every altered clause, every rerouted approval, and every strategic omission was logged, cataloged, and assessed for potential leverage. Simultaneously, Evelyn documented Lucas Whitmore's role in permitting, whether through indifference or complicity, these orchestrations to occur. Understanding that dismantling Vanessa's control required both subtlety and precision, Evelyn discreetly enlisted a trusted cadre of legal experts, financial analysts, and media contacts, individuals who could operate in the shadows yet deliver decisive impact when the moment was right. These covert allies were carefully vetted, chosen not only for skill but for discretion, ensuring that the strategies she formulated would remain unseen until deployment. With their assistance, Evelyn developed a multi-layered plan that focused on protecting her unborn child, reclaiming her influence within the corporate hierarchy, and destabilizing Vanessa's perception of invulnerability. She approached each intervention incrementally, recognizing that small victories would build both confidence and momentum, creating a cumulative effect that would eventually challenge the foundations of Vanessa's control. The first steps involved reclaiming authority over operational decisions that had been subtly redirected away from her, reasserting influence through formal channels while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Evelyn's efforts were guided by meticulous attention to timing. Actions were executed in ways that forced Vanessa to reveal her own vulnerabilities without triggering immediate defensive measures. As each subtle maneuver succeeded, Evelyn's confidence grew, reinforcing the notion that strategy, patience, and intelligence could counteract even the most sophisticated manipulations. She began mapping Vanessa's network of influence in real time, identifying the advisors, board members, and mid-level executives whose loyalties could shift with proper incentive or revelation of hidden information. The awareness of these dependencies allowed Evelyn to prepare interventions designed to isolate Vanessa, expose weaknesses, and create pressure points without direct confrontation. Psychological acuity became a core component of her strategy. Evelyn anticipated Vanessa's responses to potential moves, analyzing patterns of behavior, timing of communications, and the subtleties of decision-making processes. This predictive approach enabled her to act preemptively, turning Vanessa's own methods of control into vulnerabilities. The covert coordination with legal and financial experts facilitated precise targeting of regulatory and procedural levers. Each adjustment, each discrete inquiry, and each strategically released piece of information contributed to a mounting tension within Vanessa's network, signaling that her dominance could no longer be taken for granted. Evelyn's strategy was not driven by revenge alone. It was informed by an understanding of the long-term consequences for her child and the legacy she would inherit. By safeguarding the legal and financial structures that governed the Whitmore inheritance, she ensured that every tactical move simultaneously strengthened her position and protected future generations. This dual focus, immediate disruption of Vanessa's influence and long-term security, required the careful orchestration of multiple parallel initiatives, each dependent on timing, discretion, and the precise interpretation of human behavior. Evelyn approached this campaign with the patience of a chess player, recognizing that visible victories were less valuable than the accumulation of control and leverage over unseen levers of power. Every small success, whether reclaiming decision-making authority, correcting procedural missteps, or gathering corroborating evidence, contributed to a larger narrative that positioned her as the architect of strategic recalibration. As weeks passed, Vanessa began to encounter unexpected resistance, subtle challenges that undermined her assumptions of invulnerability. Investor questions, internal process reviews, and carefully timed inquiries created an environment of uncertainty, forcing her to devote attention to issues that had previously been invisible. Evelyn's presence, while unassuming, became increasingly influential, her authority asserted through intelligence rather than confrontation. Each incremental shift reinforced her confidence, illustrating that deliberate planning, observation, and patience could counter even the most sophisticated psychological and procedural manipulation. The cumulative effect of these interventions began to reshape the perception of power within the organization. Colleagues and advisors who had once accepted Vanessa's dominance started questioning the stability of her control, influenced not by public confrontation but by subtle demonstrations of Evelyn's analytical competence, legal acumen, and strategic foresight. Evelyn's ability to operate without attracting overt attention amplified the effectiveness of her campaign, as it denied Vanessa opportunities to counteract interventions directly. While her pregnancy continued to heighten the stakes, it also reinforced the urgency and focus of her actions. Evelyn recognized that the dual pressures of personal vulnerability and corporate responsibility demanded a higher level of precision, and she rose to meet the challenge with measured clarity. Each coordinated move, every carefully considered disclosure, and each discrete intervention reinforced a growing narrative. The once passive wife had become a silent architect of strategic recalibration, capable of dismantling influence, reclaiming authority, and safeguarding the future of her child. As Evelyn's influence expanded, she discovered weaknesses in Vanessa's operational secrecy, gaps in procedural oversight, and overconfidence in her assumed control. The recognition of these vulnerabilities provided opportunities for calculated disruption, allowing Evelyn to introduce uncertainty and exert pressure without direct confrontation. Legal reviews, financial audits, and selective dissemination of information created an environment in which Vanessa's confidence began to falter. Evelyn's foresight, methodical planning, and disciplined execution had transformed the environment of vulnerability into one of strategic advantage. Every small victory was both a practical and psychological triumph, reinforcing her sense of agency and gradually tipping the balance of power. The process demanded constant vigilance, nuanced understanding of human behavior, and the ability to synthesize complex corporate dynamics into actionable interventions. Evelyn's rise was silent, deliberate, and meticulously executed, a campaign of intelligence and foresight designed to reclaim control without exposing herself to unnecessary risk. Each decision built upon previous successes, establishing an interlocking framework of influence, authority, and protection that would ultimately undermine Vanessa's position while securing the stability of the Whitmore legacy. Her awareness of timing, observation, and procedural leverage allowed her to anticipate challenges and act with precision, gradually transforming the corporate battlefield from one of subordination to one of informed strategic dominance. By leveraging evidence, insight, and alliances with carefully chosen allies, Evelyn systematically dismantled the veneer of invulnerability Vanessa had cultivated, proving that strategy, patience, and meticulous intelligence could overcome even the most entrenched manipulations. Evelyn gains access to Vanessa's confidential plans, revealing a critical vulnerability that, if exploited correctly, could collapse her empire entirely, forcing Evelyn to prepare for a decisive move that would irreversibly shift the balance of power in her favor. Evelyn Carter had reached a turning point where patience and strategy converged, and she realized that the only way to weaken Vanessa Blake's carefully constructed dominance was to expose the hidden cracks that had been meticulously masked behind charm and public perception. Each subtle manipulation Vanessa had orchestrated, each rerouted decision, and every quiet undermining of Evelyn's authority now became a weapon in her hands, a piece of evidence she could leverage at precisely the right moment. Evelyn began systematically leaking fragments of information to key investors and board members who had previously been unaware of the full scope of Vanessa's maneuvers. She framed each revelation not as personal vendetta but as evidence of operational irregularities, highlighting inconsistencies in trust amendments, financial reallocations, and procedural oversights. The leaks were surgical, carefully crafted to expose just enough to provoke scrutiny without alarming Vanessa prematurely or signaling Evelyn's full strategic intent. The effect was immediate. Where applause and admiration had once followed Vanessa's public appearances, now whispers and questions rippled through investor circles. A subtle shift occurred in perception. The aura of invincibility Vanessa had cultivated began to waver. Small signs of unease, initially imperceptible, grew into a tangible tension within boardrooms, during investor calls, and across executive meetings. Evelyn observed each reaction with the precision of a strategist, noting the way advisors adjusted their stances, how questions became pointed, and how previously unquestioned decisions were suddenly subject to examination. The cracks in Vanessa's armor were widening, and Evelyn's careful orchestration ensured that they were visible to those who mattered most, particularly stakeholders whose confidence could determine the trajectory of the Whitmore legacy. Board members, once deferential to Vanessa's influence, began probing for justification. Questions about procedural authority, decision-making rationale, and alignment with corporate governance emerged, reflecting a growing skepticism that threatened to destabilize her network of control. Vanessa, accustomed to unquestioned authority and flawless presentation, faced the unnerving realization that scrutiny could no longer be ignored. Each challenge, each critical inquiry, forced her to expend energy and attention that had previously been reserved for consolidating influence, creating fissures in her operational coherence. Lucas Whitmore, too, began to manifest subtle signs of unease. Investor confidence, once unwavering, wavered in response to Evelyn's discreet revelations. The ripple effects were difficult for him to ignore. Board members sought explanations, financial analysts recalibrated projections, and media partners asked probing questions behind the scenes. Lucas's composure, previously a buffer that insulated Vanessa from accountability, began to crack under the growing pressure. And Evelyn recognized that the psychological balance within the company was shifting in her favor. Yet Evelyn remained cautious. She understood that timing was critical. Overexposure could alert Vanessa to the full scope of her strategy, provoking a counterattack that might neutralize months of preparation. Each leak, each disclosure, had to be carefully calculated to maximize impact while preserving the element of surprise. Evelyn's approach was methodical, blending intelligence gathering, analysis of behavioral patterns, and precise dissemination of information to ensure that the unfolding scrutiny weakened Vanessa incrementally rather than triggering defensive consolidation. The subtle undermining of Vanessa's public image was complemented by Evelyn's cultivation of discreet support among investors and board members. She identified individuals whose alignment with Vanessa was tenuous, whose confidence could be swayed by evidence and the demonstration of ethical oversight. By reinforcing their awareness of operational discrepancies, Evelyn created a network of accountability that gradually eroded Vanessa's unassailable position. Vanessa, for all her skill and precision, had underestimated the depth of Evelyn's strategic patience and the acuity with which she could deploy influence. Each small victory emboldened Evelyn further, increasing her confidence in the timing and sequence of her interventions. She recognized patterns of overconfidence and operational reliance that, when targeted, produced disproportionate effects, magnifying the perception of vulnerability without requiring confrontation. The psychological impact on Vanessa became apparent in her public demeanor. Moments that had once radiated confidence were now tinged with uncertainty. Slight hesitations became noticeable, and her gestures of control, previously effortless, now carried subtle tension. Investors and board members, attuned to these cues, began questioning decisions that had previously been accepted without scrutiny, a shift Evelyn had anticipated and prepared to exploit. The strategic exposure was compounded by Evelyn's discreet cultivation of media contacts who could subtly amplify the perception of instability. Articles, reports, and industry commentary were carefully managed to highlight anomalies in corporate procedures without overtly framing them as scandal, reinforcing the sense that Vanessa's influence was no longer unchallengeable. Evelyn's approach balanced caution with decisiveness, ensuring that each step advanced her position while maintaining the guise of procedural integrity and operational competence. The cumulative effect of these maneuvers created an environment in which Vanessa's dominance, once assumed and unquestioned, began to erode visibly. Confidence gaps emerged, strategic overextensions became apparent, and the internal cohesion of her support network weakened. Evelyn's patient orchestration ensured that the cracks in Vanessa's armor were evident to those whose decisions carried the greatest weight, establishing a foundation for further strategic advances. Even Lucas, observing the ripple effects, was confronted with a reality he could no longer ignore. Evelyn's interventions were precise, informed, and systematically shifting the balance of power. The psychological dynamic within the company had changed. Where once Evelyn had been passive and vulnerable, she now operated from a position of informed strength, carefully guiding perception, influence, and accountability to challenge Vanessa's supremacy. Each incremental exposure, each whispered concern among investors, each critical question raised in board meetings was part of a deliberate campaign to destabilize a previously unassailable position. Evelyn understood that the process required patience, foresight, and continuous observation, as any misstep could compromise the advantage she had cultivated. The awareness of these dynamics reinforced the necessity of timing, precision, and strategic clarity in her ongoing efforts to reclaim influence and protect both her interests and those of her unborn child. Evelyn's rise was subtle yet inexorable. The meticulously planned dissemination of evidence and carefully orchestrated interventions produced tangible results, gradually revealing the vulnerabilities in Vanessa's network while reinforcing Evelyn's own position as a capable, analytical, and determined strategist. The cumulative effect of these maneuvers created a perception of fragility in Vanessa's empire that had previously been invisible, destabilizing the psychological foundation of her influence and establishing conditions for further disruption. Evelyn's patient execution demonstrated the potency of intelligence, observation, and strategic foresight over overt confrontation, transforming the battlefield from one of intimidation to one of calculated leverage. Each measure taken, each carefully timed disclosure, and every piece of evidence presented was part of a broader architecture designed to erode Vanessa's perceived invulnerability while reinforcing Evelyn's agency and control over the unfolding corporate narrative. Vanessa discovers Evelyn's methodical exposure and begins plotting a counterattack, escalating the stakes further and signaling that the next phase of their battle will be defined by strategy, deception, and psychological maneuvering, with the balance of power more uncertain than ever. Lucas Whitmore, for all his public confidence and billion-dollar empire, had a critical blind spot that Evelyn Carter had begun to recognize and exploit with precision. He had long measured his success in terms of wealth accumulation, market influence, and media perception, assuming that loyalty and personal allegiance were secondary variables in the vast machinery of his company. This miscalculation had allowed Vanessa Blake to operate with near impunity, consolidating influence while Lucas remained preoccupied with external appearances and long-term financial forecasts. The operational vulnerabilities within Whitmore Enterprises, which Lucas considered inconsequential or simply part of standard corporate risk, were now visible to Evelyn in stark detail. She saw weaknesses in procedural oversight, gaps in internal reporting, and the subtle but systematic erosion of checks and balances that Vanessa had cultivated over time. Where Lucas had assumed that structural robustness would protect the empire, Evelyn recognized that these vulnerabilities were active levers of power, capable of being manipulated to shift influence and destabilize previously secure authority. As investor sentiment began to shift in response to earlier disclosures and subtle leaks orchestrated by Evelyn, she observed ripples of concern spreading quietly through the financial community. Public media had yet to detect the underlying instability, but in boardrooms, conference calls, and private investor briefings, questions were emerging, tentative at first but gaining intensity with each passing day. The growing unease was a sign that confidence in both leadership and strategy was beginning to erode, a phenomenon Lucas seemed slow to perceive because he continued to prioritize optics over operational vigilance. Evelyn, sensing the widening gap between perception and reality, began exploiting these openings. She identified overlooked channels of oversight, gaps in communication, and weaknesses in reporting protocols that allowed her to gather actionable intelligence without alerting Vanessa or Lucas to her full scope of activity. Each discovery provided leverage, offering opportunities to subtly influence decisions, expose inconsistencies, and build pressure on Vanessa's network while maintaining her own discretion. The complexity of the situation required Evelyn to balance timing, precision, and psychological awareness, knowing that any misstep could reveal her intentions prematurely. She monitored investor behavior, noting the shift in questions and concerns, and correlated these with procedural vulnerabilities she had identified, creating a comprehensive map of the empire's current fragility. Meanwhile, Vanessa, previously confident in Lucas's support and the stability of her own control, began to sense an erosion of certainty. Subtle hesitations, minor deviations from expected responses, and unexpected challenges to her initiatives sparked doubt. She had assumed Lucas would remain an immovable pillar behind her, but the combination of Evelyn's calculated exposure of vulnerabilities and the emerging uncertainty in investor confidence introduced a tension that destabilized her previously secure alliance. This discord became apparent in subtle ways. Missed communications, reevaluation of priorities, and an increased tendency toward defensive posturing. Evelyn recognized the significance of this shift and knew that the erosion of unity between Vanessa and Lucas could be leveraged strategically. The misalignment of support, if timed and executed carefully, could amplify the impact of Evelyn's interventions, creating openings for more decisive action without requiring overt confrontation. Evelyn's approach involved meticulous observation, patient accumulation of intelligence, and the careful testing of boundaries. Each opportunity to exploit Lucas's blind spots was balanced with caution, ensuring that the company's operational continuity remained intact while her influence increased incrementally. In addition to monitoring interpersonal dynamics, Evelyn scrutinized financial structures for anomalies that could serve as leverage. She identified subtle inconsistencies in cash flows, asset allocations, and resource management that had been overlooked in routine audits. Each gap represented a potential tool, a mechanism to create constraint or pressure without directly confronting Vanessa or destabilizing the empire outright. The awareness that Lucas's inattention and preoccupation with external prestige had created exploitable gaps strengthened Evelyn's resolve. She understood that the Empire's foundations, while seemingly robust, were in fact highly sensitive to precise manipulations and strategic interventions. By capitalizing on these blind spots, she could exert influence far beyond what her formal position would suggest, shaping decisions, perceptions, and access to resources in a controlled and measured fashion. Evelyn's confidence grew as she anticipated responses from both Vanessa and Lucas, predicting where hesitations, over-reliance, or miscommunication might occur. Each strategic observation allowed her to refine the timing and method of her actions, ensuring that every intervention would achieve maximum impact while preserving the security of her unborn child's inheritance and her professional standing. The subtleties of this strategic maneuvering required Evelyn to operate with a constant awareness of optics, perception, and relational dynamics. Every interaction, every decision, and every disclosure had to be carefully calibrated to influence behavior without revealing the full scope of her strategy. By maintaining this careful balance, Evelyn ensured that Vanessa's confidence would continue to erode internally, while outward appearances suggested continuity and stability. The consequences of this approach became increasingly evident as operational errors, previously dismissed as minor, began to attract scrutiny. Decisions that Vanessa had assumed would proceed unchallenged were questioned, creating friction and forcing reallocation of attention. Lucas, still unaware of the full extent of Evelyn's interventions, began noticing discrepancies in outcomes, questioning processes he had long assumed were stable. The subtle tension between perception and reality allowed Evelyn to exert psychological pressure on both adversaries, creating uncertainty that would enhance the effectiveness of her subsequent moves. Evelyn also identified potential legal and procedural levers that could be employed in the event of a critical escalation. These levers, while not requiring immediate action, offered additional avenues to constrain Vanessa's influence and safeguard the inheritance structure. Each potential intervention was evaluated in terms of timing, impact, and risk, ensuring that the overall strategy remained coherent, incremental, and effective. As the awareness of operational fragility grew, Evelyn realized that the Empire's apparent strength was an illusion supported by Lucas's blind confidence and Vanessa's assumed control. By methodically exploiting this blind spot, she could shift the balance of power, creating leverage that would allow her to negotiate, influence, and ultimately reclaim authority without resorting to confrontation or public exposure. Each discovery, each analysis, and each subtle adjustment reinforced Evelyn's understanding that even the most powerful empires are vulnerable when attention to internal coherence, oversight, and relational dynamics is neglected. The cumulative effect of these interventions was profound. Investor confidence, while still outwardly stable, began to show cracks that Evelyn could anticipate and manipulate. Vanessa's internal tension increased, Lucas's misjudgment became a source of leverage, and the operational gaps within the corporation allowed Evelyn to position herself as a quietly commanding presence capable of shaping outcomes. The awareness that control and perception were inseparable informed every action she took, ensuring that her strategy combined psychological insight, operational intelligence, and strategic foresight. Evelyn's rise from marginalized observer to influential strategist was deliberate, patient, and precise, exploiting vulnerabilities created by overconfidence, neglect, and calculated assumptions. Her ability to anticipate and respond to subtle shifts within the empire positioned her to capitalize on weaknesses before they could be addressed or concealed, transforming the perceived strength of Whitmore Enterprises into a landscape of strategic opportunity. Evelyn uncovers a financial loophole within Whitmore Enterprises' trust and operational structures that, if triggered, could instantly freeze Vanessa's access to key resources, forcing both adversaries to confront the fragility of their positions and setting the stage for a decisive shift in control over the empire. Evelyn Carter had reached a stage in her struggle where subtlety became as powerful as strategy, and psychological acuity replaced brute force as the principal instrument of control. With Vanessa Blake's network of influence still formidable yet showing initial fissures, Evelyn recognized that manipulating perception and sowing uncertainty could undermine her adversary far more effectively than any direct confrontation. She began planting carefully curated misinformation within Vanessa's circle, crafting minor discrepancies and fabricated operational rumors designed to test loyalties and provoke reactions. These subtle manipulations were tailored to exploit pre-existing tensions, rivalries, and ambitions, ensuring that the web of influence surrounding Vanessa could be destabilized without leaving evidence that traced back to Evelyn herself. Each strategically positioned rumor acted as a litmus test, revealing which allies were genuinely loyal, which were opportunistic, and which were susceptible to influence. Evelyn observed with meticulous precision as Vanessa reacted, noting the rapidity, intensity, and manner of her responses. Vanessa's usual composure gave way to calculated aggression, subtle intimidation, and the precise exertion of pressure on those she considered loyal, all intended to suppress doubt and reassert dominance. Yet these displays of control, though outwardly convincing, began to reveal cracks under the weight of unseen manipulation. Evelyn, anticipating these responses, used the patterns she observed to adjust her approach in real time, creating a continuous cycle of calculated misdirection that increased the psychological strain on her adversary. Lucas Whitmore, too, began noticing subtle inconsistencies in the reports and communications he received from Vanessa. Numbers that had been stable, timelines that had previously aligned, and decisions that seemed logical on the surface now appeared to diverge in ways that raised questions about accuracy and accountability. These inconsistencies, while not yet publicly evident, began to disrupt the trust Lucas had long placed in Vanessa's judgment, introducing tension into the executive dynamic and further weakening the perception of her unassailable authority. Evelyn's mastery of suspense allowed her to amplify these effects. She withheld key pieces of information strategically, allowing uncertainty to grow organically, encouraging both overconfidence and miscalculation within Vanessa's circle. By controlling the timing, scope, and nature of information exposure, Evelyn transformed routine corporate procedures into a subtle battlefield, where fear, doubt, and anticipation were leveraged as instruments of influence. The cumulative psychological pressure began to manifest in Vanessa's public performance. Whereas once she had projected seamless confidence and effortless control, she now exhibited signs of hesitation, minor overreactions, and inconsistencies that were observable to those trained to detect such vulnerabilities. The public image Vanessa relied upon to command loyalty and intimidate rivals was increasingly fragile, and Evelyn knew that reinforcing this perception at strategic moments would compound the effectiveness of her broader campaign. Evelyn also began exploiting interpersonal tensions within Vanessa's network. By observing micro-expressions, body language, and subtle shifts in dialogue, she was able to anticipate moments when allies might question instructions, hesitate, or overcompensate in their displays of loyalty. These insights allowed Evelyn to calibrate her interventions, releasing misinformation, timing disclosures, or manipulating procedural expectations to maximize disruption and uncertainty. Each calculated action reinforced the perception that Vanessa's authority, though still formidable, was increasingly vulnerable to pressure, scrutiny, and misalignment. Evelyn's psychological strategy was reinforced by her understanding of human behavior under stress. She recognized that sustained uncertainty and subtle challenges to competence could undermine decision-making, amplify self-doubt, and create openings for strategic maneuvering. By leveraging these principles, she orchestrated a controlled environment in which Vanessa's responses became predictable, observable, and exploitable. The interplay between observed behavior and calculated intervention became a continuous feedback loop, with Evelyn adjusting her tactics based on real-time observations of reactions, anticipation of next moves, and subtle assessment of vulnerabilities. Even as the psychological pressure intensified, Evelyn maintained discipline, avoiding overt confrontation while ensuring that each maneuver incrementally strengthened her position. The awareness that she could influence perception without direct engagement allowed her to extend her strategic reach, shaping both internal dynamics and the broader narrative surrounding the Whitmore legacy. At the same time, Evelyn carefully managed her own visibility. She ensured that her interventions remained covert, maintaining the appearance of compliance, discretion, and professional detachment. This dual approach, simultaneously influencing perception and concealing agency, enhanced the potency of her maneuvers, forcing Vanessa to expend energy and attention on threats that appeared diffuse yet were precisely orchestrated. Evelyn also anticipated potential counteractions, preparing contingency strategies for every likely response. She analyzed the likely adjustments Vanessa would make in her communications, decision-making, and influence management, ensuring that any attempt to regain stability would encounter calculated resistance. This preemptive planning transformed psychological pressure into a tool for incremental gain, reinforcing Evelyn's control over the tempo of the conflict and the perceptions of both internal and external stakeholders. As the manipulation progressed, Evelyn noted the cumulative effects on Vanessa's network. Advisors, previously unquestioning in their loyalty, began signaling uncertainty, hesitating in their actions, and seeking reassurance from one another rather than relying solely on Vanessa's guidance. This subtle erosion of cohesion provided Evelyn with leverage points, allowing her to introduce control challenges and further heighten the perception of vulnerability. Each intervention, each piece of misinformation, and each carefully timed disclosure contributed to a growing narrative in which Vanessa's dominance was no longer absolute, in which her decisions could be questioned, and in which the perception of infallibility had been irrevocably undermined. Evelyn's psychological warfare was deliberate, methodical, and executed with unwavering patience. She understood that overt action would provoke immediate countermeasures, whereas subtle, cumulative influence could create conditions favorable to her ultimate objectives: the protection of her unborn child, the reclamation of authority, and the gradual dismantling of Vanessa's seemingly impenetrable network. The strategy required constant observation, precise timing, and the ability to interpret nuanced behaviors in real time, all while maintaining operational discretion and public composure. Evelyn's approach exemplified the principle that in high-stakes psychological contests, perception often outweighs tangible power. Evelyn's approach exemplified the principle that in high-stakes psychological contests, perception often outweighs tangible power. By shaping fear, doubt, and anticipation within Vanessa's sphere of influence, she effectively turned the environment into a controlled battlefield, where each decision, hesitation, and reaction could be leveraged to her advantage. The interplay of deception, strategic disclosure, and anticipation allowed Evelyn to manipulate both perception and action simultaneously, ensuring that momentum remained firmly in her favor without resorting to confrontation or overt disclosure of her own position. Every subtle shift in Vanessa's behavior, every hesitation or overcompensation, became data that Evelyn used to refine her next interventions, creating a continuous cycle of psychological influence that reinforced her ascendancy and destabilized her adversary. Vanessa receives an anonymous tip revealing Evelyn's most critical maneuver, forcing her into a risky strategic gamble that could either restore her dominance or accelerate her own unraveling, escalating the psychological stakes to a point where every next decision carries irreversible consequences. The day Evelyn Carter had long prepared for finally arrived, a day in which the culmination of her meticulous strategy, patient observation, and relentless collection of evidence would meet the formal scrutiny of the Whitmore board. The atmosphere in the towering glass conference room was thick with anticipation and quiet tension, a space where every gesture, glance, and inflection carried weight far beyond the immediate moment. Evelyn began the proceedings with calm authority, presenting documentation she had assembled over weeks, detailing Vanessa Blake's manipulations, financial misdirections, and strategic interventions that had systematically eroded her influence. She coupled this evidence with a careful exposition of Lucas Whitmore's complacency, highlighting how his inattention and silent complicity had allowed these maneuvers to occur unchecked. The board members listened intently, the room vibrating with a sense of gravity and latent suspense. Investor sentiment, which had previously been quietly shifting in response to subtle leaks and strategic disclosures, now manifested in the form of pointed questions, expressions of concern, and a visible recalibration of alliances. The momentum that Evelyn had built over months of patient maneuvering began to transform the boardroom dynamic. Previously unquestioned supporters of Vanessa now hesitated, their confidence faltering as the weight of evidence became undeniable. The subtle realignment of allegiances, previously invisible to casual observation, became overt in the room's interactions. Advisors whispered to one another, exchanged glances, and began reconsidering their stances in ways that had been carefully anticipated and indirectly encouraged by Evelyn's preparatory work. Vanessa, aware of the shifting perception but still underestimating the precision and timing of Evelyn's actions, attempted to regain control. She delivered reassurances, emphasized her operational competence, and sought to remind the board of her long-standing contributions to the empire. Yet her interventions were carefully calculated responses to an environment Evelyn had already anticipated, and the board, now primed by both subtle pressure and incontrovertible evidence, met her attempts with scrutiny rather than deference. Every question raised, every clarification demanded, chipped away at the previously unassailable perception of Vanessa's dominance. Lucas Whitmore, seated beside her, confronted the consequences of his past inaction for the first time with tangible immediacy. He had long believed that silence preserved stability and that external appearances could mask internal fractures. Yet the controlled exposure orchestrated by Evelyn revealed the full extent of vulnerabilities that he had ignored. Investor confidence, previously assumed to be resilient, now wavered visibly, and Lucas could not shield Vanessa from the consequences of her previously hidden manipulations. Evelyn's strategic approach relied not on confrontation but on the precise sequencing of information, the orchestration of timing, and the careful observation of psychological response. She leveraged the cumulative tension to gradually tilt the perception of power within the room. Each revelation, subtle yet undeniable, allowed her to reclaim authority without directly attacking or publicly humiliating either Vanessa or Lucas. The art of timing, so critical in psychological strategy, ensured that each board member received the evidence at a moment designed to maximize impact, prompting reassessment, reflection, and recalibration of alliances. As the session progressed, the dynamics of influence became increasingly visible. Board members who had once aligned with Vanessa began questioning prior decisions, probing for clarification, and signaling tacit openness to Evelyn's perspective. Investor sentiment, quietly observed by advisors and analysts alike, shifted dramatically, amplifying the strategic advantage Evelyn had cultivated. The alignment of influence, perception, and timing created an environment in which momentum favored her position, gradually reshaping the architecture of authority within the Whitmore enterprise. Vanessa, recognizing the shifting currents, attempted reactive maneuvers to restore stability. She emphasized procedural fidelity, highlighted her long-term contributions, and sought to assert control over operational narratives. Yet her timing was consistently one step behind, her responses anticipated and counterbalanced by Evelyn's foresight. The precision of Evelyn's preparatory strategy had created a rhythm in which Vanessa's attempts at reclamation inadvertently reinforced the perception of vulnerability, compounding the impact of each previous disclosure. Lucas, increasingly aware of the consequences, faced the uncomfortable reality that his prior reliance on inaction had facilitated a fragility in both authority and perception that now required immediate engagement. His attempts to intervene, mediated by concern for continuity and legacy, intersected with Evelyn's carefully staged disclosures, forcing a recalibration of influence that simultaneously highlighted past negligence and presented an opening for corrective action under Evelyn's strategic guidance. The interplay of alliances, perceptions, and procedural leverage transformed the boardroom into a dynamic battlefield of influence. Evelyn's methodical presentation and calibrated interventions generated an environment in which both psychological and operational factors were realigned in her favor. Each subtle acknowledgement, each hesitant question, and each recalibration of support strengthened her authority while systematically reducing Vanessa's perceived invulnerability. The cumulative effect of these maneuvers was tangible. Strategic alliances realigned in ways Evelyn had anticipated, with previously passive board members now actively reconsidering decisions and potential courses of action. Investor behavior, although indirect, began to signal expectations that prioritized transparency, accountability, and the mitigation of risk over loyalty to Vanessa, further amplifying her exposure. Evelyn's campaign in the boardroom demonstrated that patient observation, careful documentation, and precise timing could achieve outcomes as decisive as any overt confrontation. By leveraging intelligence, anticipation, and psychological pressure, she had transformed a previously hierarchical, unyielding environment into one where perception and timing dictated the balance of power. Vanessa's underestimation of Evelyn's capabilities had created a critical vulnerability, one that Evelyn exploited without unnecessary escalation, preserving both professional composure and operational continuity. As the evidence was reviewed, board members began discussing emergency measures, procedural safeguards, and restructuring options that had previously been unnecessary. The tension in the room was palpable. The delicate balance between authority, perception, and operational stability teetered on a knife's edge. Every decision, every clarification, and every consideration of risk carried amplified significance, underscoring the fragility of the empire's internal equilibrium and the effectiveness of Evelyn's strategic orchestration. By the conclusion of the session, the alignment of momentum, perception, and intelligence positioned Evelyn to influence outcomes decisively. Her patient, disciplined, and psychologically informed approach had shifted the board's perspective, creating openings for corrective action that preserved her interests, safeguarded her unborn child, and undermined Vanessa's dominance without requiring overt confrontation. The culmination of strategic patience, meticulous observation, and precise manipulation of perception had brought the boardroom to a critical juncture, where the empire's internal hierarchy could no longer function under assumptions of unchallenged authority. Evelyn had transformed prior vulnerability into opportunity, leveraging intelligence and foresight to secure advantage while maintaining discretion and professionalism. The calculated precision of her campaign ensured that the next moves in the unfolding conflict would be governed by timing, observation, and strategic leverage, setting the stage for a decisive structural intervention that would redefine the balance of power within Whitmore Enterprises. The board, now fully aware of the evidence and its implications, demands an emergency restructuring vote, placing both Lucas and Vanessa at a precarious crossroads and forcing Evelyn to prepare for the decisive phase of her campaign that could irrevocably alter the Whitmore legacy. The results of the emergency board vote reverberated through Whitmore Enterprises with a force that few could have anticipated, and Evelyn Carter observed the unfolding consequences with a blend of satisfaction and strategic caution. Vanessa Blake, who had previously projected unassailable dominance, was now confronted with a reality in which her authority had been significantly curtailed. The formal decision, passed with a majority that reflected the realignment of loyalties Evelyn had meticulously orchestrated, imposed stringent limitations on Vanessa's operational control, redirecting key decisions, approvals, and discretionary powers to oversight committees and interim governance structures. This reallocation of authority struck at the core of Vanessa's influence, simultaneously undermining her perceived control and signaling to investors and board members that her previously unchecked decision-making capacity was no longer inviolable. The immediate impact on public perception was profound. Where confidence and admiration had once surrounded her public appearances, whispers of doubt and scrutiny replaced applause. Investors, informed by the subtle disclosures and careful presentation of evidence orchestrated by Evelyn, began recalibrating their evaluations of risk, influence, and operational integrity. Financial analysts adjusted projections to account for potential disruptions in Vanessa's management, while internal teams hesitated, uncertain of the direction of future initiatives. Vanessa's network, carefully constructed over months of subtle manipulation and psychological dominance, began to fray. Key advisors and mid-level managers, who had previously deferred without question to her judgment, now approached decisions with caution, evaluating each directive against the newly established oversight structures. The confidence that had once radiated through her interactions weakened under the weight of scrutiny, and minor hesitations began to compound, creating the first visible cracks in the structure of control she had so meticulously built. Lucas Whitmore, confronted with the consequences of his prior inaction and complacency, experienced a parallel form of humiliation. The empire he had assumed was stable and unshakable revealed vulnerabilities he had underestimated. His silence during prior maneuvers, which had been interpreted as neutrality or rational risk management, now reflected an action that had allowed a calculated erosion of authority. For the first time, he recognized the personal and professional costs of disregarding the intricate dynamics that governed loyalty, influence, and perception. Evelyn, observing the ripple effects with measured attention, began consolidating her position strategically. She understood that while dismantling Vanessa's authority was critical, maintaining stability for the company and safeguarding the legal and financial future of her unborn child were equally paramount. Her interventions were deliberate, targeted, and executed without unnecessary provocation, ensuring that the reallocation of power preserved institutional integrity while simultaneously strengthening her influence. Each procedural adjustment, each carefully timed communication, and each discreet assertion of authority reinforced the legal and operational frameworks that would protect her child's inheritance. Evelyn's approach demonstrated the subtle interplay between assertive strategy and cautious stewardship. While the board had limited Vanessa's power, Evelyn ensured that the transition of influence was managed with precision, reinforcing the perception of continuity and professionalism while dismantling the adversary's control. The cumulative effect of these maneuvers was both practical and psychological. Vanessa, confronted with reduced authority, began to experience the first real sense of exposure since her rise to dominance. The advisors and allies she had relied upon for tactical support now hesitated, weighed options against the board's oversight, and expressed concerns regarding accountability. These shifts, though incremental, created a growing sense of isolation. Without overt confrontation, Evelyn's strategic patience had transformed a previously dominant figure into one whose network was fragmenting under the weight of scrutiny and institutional correction. Investor reactions, though measured publicly, reflected this shift. Communications between stakeholders revealed subtle expressions of doubt, hesitation in approving previously routine allocations, and inquiries into procedural compliance. Each instance reinforced the perception that Vanessa's control was no longer absolute, undermining confidence and creating openings for further strategic initiatives. Evelyn's consolidation of authority did not rely on aggression or punitive measures. Instead, she focused on reinforcing the structures that safeguarded both her influence and the operational stability of Whitmore Enterprises. Key decisions were redirected through channels she controlled, oversight mechanisms were implemented with discretion, and advisors were guided to recognize both accountability and strategic alignment with her objectives. This approach ensured that the company remained functional, investors retained confidence, and Vanessa's ability to manipulate outcomes was increasingly constrained. The psychological dimension of this transformation was equally significant. Vanessa, previously characterized by confidence and control, began exhibiting subtle signs of tension, hesitation, and uncertainty. Her once commanding interactions with staff and board members were now interspersed with pauses, careful calculations, and overcompensation intended to mask vulnerability. Evelyn, observing these shifts, recognized the growing efficacy of her strategic patience and psychological leverage. Each hesitation, each recalibration of authority within Vanessa's network, amplified the impact of prior interventions, reinforcing the perception of fragility and vulnerability. In this environment, Evelyn could maneuver with precision, using minimal overt action to maximize influence. Operational gaps and misalignments became opportunities to guide outcomes, shape perception, and secure resources critical to the stability of both her position and her child's future. The dismantling of Vanessa's network continued incrementally. Allies previously aligned out of fear or ambition reevaluated loyalties, and informal channels of support began to shift subtly toward Evelyn's emerging authority. Procedural realignments, implemented through the oversight of board-mandated structures, reinforced the redistribution of power, creating a feedback loop in which strategic patience produced tangible operational consequences. Evelyn's efforts reflected an understanding of the intricate interplay between perception, authority, and institutional governance. By combining legal safeguards, strategic disclosures, and careful observation of psychological reactions, she ensured that the erosion of Vanessa's dominance was both irreversible and controlled. The timing and sequence of interventions minimized risk to her own position while maximizing impact on the adversary. As the transformation of the corporate landscape progressed, Evelyn anticipated potential countermeasures, preparing contingency plans to preempt or neutralize any desperate maneuver Vanessa might attempt. The meticulous attention to detail, timing, and perception management ensured that the initiative remained firmly in Evelyn's control, even as Vanessa's influence waned. Evelyn's strategic brilliance was evident in her ability to consolidate power while maintaining stability, preserving operational continuity, and safeguarding her child's legal and financial future. By converting psychological insight, procedural awareness, and precise timing into effective authority, she transformed the boardroom and executive environment into a landscape dominated by foresight and calculated influence rather than coercion or force. Vanessa, faced with the collapse of her network and the curtailment of her authority, begins plotting a final desperate maneuver designed to reclaim control and influence. But Evelyn, anticipating every contingency, is already several steps ahead, preparing to counteract and neutralize this last attempt to destabilize her carefully reconstructed position. Evelyn Carter had navigated a labyrinth of betrayal, manipulation, and subtle psychological warfare, and now, at last, the culmination of her careful strategy began to manifest as tangible authority and restored security. The legal structures she had meticulously reinforced now fell decisively in her favor. Through coordinated efforts with trusted legal advisors, she secured complete control over the Whitmore Trust, ensuring that her unborn child's inheritance and future interests were fully protected against any residual machinations from Vanessa Blake or other opportunistic actors. Every clause, amendment, and procedural safeguard had been reviewed, reinforced, and verified, transforming the previously vulnerable position into a fortress of legal authority that could not be contested without exposing the challenger to substantial scrutiny and liability. This consolidation of power was accompanied by a dramatic shift in public perception. Where Evelyn had once been seen merely as a passive, humiliated spouse, the narrative now cast her as a resilient, intelligent architect of justice, a woman who had endured humiliation and adversity and emerged not only unbroken but strategically triumphant. Media outlets, investors, and industry commentators highlighted her foresight, discipline, and unwavering focus, portraying her as a figure of integrity and strategic acumen whose influence was now undeniable. This shift in perception served multiple purposes. It reinforced her legitimacy in the corporate arena, stabilized investor confidence in the wake of prior disruptions, and undermined any lingering attempts by Vanessa to reclaim credibility or sway decision-makers. Lucas Whitmore, confronted with the consequences of his previous inaction and the strategic brilliance Evelyn had displayed, was compelled to publicly reconcile with his prior silence and reassess his role in the unfolding corporate and familial landscape. His authority, while still substantial, was now intertwined with Evelyn's emerging dominance, and his prior decisions or indecisions were no longer shielded by public perception. The recalibration of authority required careful diplomacy. Evelyn approached it with strategic foresight, ensuring that Lucas retained enough visibility and credibility to maintain operational continuity while simultaneously acknowledging the consequences of earlier negligence. This delicate balancing act reinforced her position while preserving the stability of Whitmore Enterprises, illustrating her capacity to navigate complex power dynamics with precision. Evelyn also turned her attention to restoring and strengthening alliances across the corporate landscape. Advisors, board members, and mid-level executives, previously caught between conflicting loyalties, were now guided through a careful process of reintegration and alignment, ensuring long-term stability for the enterprise. Through targeted communication, demonstrations of competence, and the strategic display of influence, Evelyn fostered renewed trust, reinforcing structures that would prevent future attempts at manipulation or subversion. Every action was deliberate, measured, and designed to ensure that authority, perception, and operational coherence were all aligned in a manner that favored sustainable control rather than reactive dominance. Vanessa Blake, once the unassailable force behind subtle manipulations and psychological intimidation, found her influence systematically neutralized. The limitations imposed by the board, the shift in investor confidence, and Evelyn's strategic consolidation of authority rendered her prior network increasingly ineffective. Allies withdrew or recalibrated their loyalties. Operational channels previously under her control were redirected or overseen, and her public image, once carefully cultivated, began to show irreparable cracks. The combination of legal fortification, strategic communication, and procedural oversight left Vanessa marginalized, her ambitions curtailed, and her professional legacy tarnished in ways that could not be undone. Evelyn's approach to this consolidation reflected both discipline and foresight. She avoided unnecessary destruction or humiliation, focusing instead on measurable outcomes, long-term security, and operational stability. Every action was deliberate, measured, and designed to ensure that authority, perception, and operational coherence were all aligned in a manner that favored sustainable control rather than reactive dominance. Vanessa Blake, once the unassailable force behind subtle manipulations and psychological intimidation, found her influence systematically neutralized. The limitations imposed by the board, the shift in investor confidence, and Evelyn's strategic consolidation of authority rendered her prior network increasingly ineffective. Allies withdrew or recalibrated their loyalties. Operational channels previously under her control were redirected or overseen, and her public image, once carefully cultivated, began to show irreparable cracks. The combination of legal fortification, strategic communication, and procedural oversight left Vanessa marginalized, her ambitions curtailed, and her professional legacy tarnished in ways that could not be undone. Evelyn's approach to this consolidation reflected both discipline and foresight. She avoided unnecessary destruction or humiliation, focusing instead on measurable outcomes, long-term security, and operational stability. Evelyn Carter stood at the apex of a transformation few could have foreseen, the culmination of months of strategy, patience, and meticulous observation that had turned humiliation and marginalization into a platform for enduring authority. She had emerged not only unbroken but fundamentally empowered, now recognized as the true guardian of the Whitmore legacy, a position she had secured through a combination of strategic insight, psychological acuity, and an unwavering focus on long-term outcomes. Every maneuver, every subtle intervention she had executed in the shadows of boardrooms and corporate events had converged to place her in a position of undeniable influence, where her decisions carried weight and her authority was respected by those who had once dismissed her as peripheral. Vanessa Blake, who had once orchestrated a network of subtle manipulations and psychological intimidation, now faced a downfall that was as complete as it was instructive. The empire she had built on charm, strategy, and perceived invulnerability crumbled under the weight of evidence, oversight, and Evelyn's precise interventions. Allies who had deferred to her authority shifted allegiance. Investor confidence that had reinforced her dominance evaporated, and the narrative of untouchable influence she had cultivated unraveled. The cautionary tale of her rise and fall became an unmistakable example for those who equated cunning manipulation with lasting power. The structural, procedural, and psychological foundations of influence proved far more decisive than bravado or ambition alone. Lucas Whitmore, forced to confront the irreversible consequences of his prior inaction, acknowledged Evelyn's authority with measured acceptance. He recognized that the restructuring of his empire was now permanent, that the balance of power had shifted in ways that could not be undone without substantial risk, and that Evelyn's competence, strategic clarity, and foresight had ensured that the integrity of the Whitmore legacy was now aligned with prudence, justice, and accountability. This reconciliation, though subtle and professional, underscored the transformation of authority from inherited position to earned respect, demonstrating that power, when exercised with intelligence and foresight, could surpass the conventional bounds of wealth and reputation. Evelyn's focus extended beyond immediate control. She ensured that her unborn child's inheritance was fully secured, legally untouchable, and insulated from future attempts at manipulation or exploitation. Through careful coordination with legal advisors, financial experts, and corporate governance specialists, she created structures that would protect her family's legacy for generations, translating strategic victories in the present into enduring security for the future. Each element of this consolidation, legal, financial, procedural, and relational, was executed with precision, reflecting Evelyn's understanding that lasting authority required both tactical brilliance and the foresight to anticipate emerging threats. As the corporate and personal battles concluded, Evelyn took a moment of reflection, observing the life she carried, a symbol of triumph over adversity, resilience in the face of manipulation, and justice achieved through patience and intellect. The humiliation she had endured, the betrayals she had weathered, and the strategic battles she had navigated had forged a strength that transcended circumstance, transforming vulnerability into insight, fear into calculation, and isolation into influence. The Whitmore legacy, once vulnerable to ambition, negligence, and subtle manipulation, was now fortified under her guidance. Systems of oversight, accountability, and strategic foresight ensured that future generations would inherit not just wealth but a structure of resilience, a framework in which ethical and strategic leadership could prevent the recurrence of destabilizing influences. Evelyn's triumph was not merely operational or legal. It was profoundly psychological. By converting adversity into agency, she had reshaped the perceptions of those around her, establishing a narrative of competence, integrity, and unwavering focus that commanded respect and loyalty. Her victory demonstrated the interplay between strategic patience and calculated action, showing that even in complex, high-stakes environments, deliberate observation and precise interventions could yield decisive outcomes. While the immediate threats posed by Vanessa's ambitions and the instability within the corporate hierarchy had been neutralized, Evelyn remained acutely aware that the landscape of influence was inherently dynamic. Vigilance was essential, as latent threats, emergent challenges, and unforeseen contingencies could arise at any moment, demanding the same level of insight, patience, and strategic adaptability that had defined her rise. Her reflection extended to the lessons embedded in the journey itself. Humiliation, betrayal, and systemic challenges were not merely obstacles but instruments of clarity, forging resilience, sharpening perception, and illuminating opportunities for decisive action. Evelyn recognized that true power was not static. It required constant awareness, adaptive thinking, and the capacity to act with both foresight and precision. The ultimate consolidation of her position was therefore both a victory and a preparation, a foundation upon which continued vigilance, strategic innovation, and the safeguarding of legacy could be maintained. The symbolic observation of her child represented more than personal triumph. It embodied the convergence of justice, foresight, and resilience, illustrating that the careful orchestration of strategy, legal authority, and psychological acumen could safeguard not just immediate interests but the continuity of legacy across time. Every system reinforced, every ally aligned, and every procedural safeguard implemented contributed to a structure in which influence and control were resilient to both internal and external pressures. Evelyn's legacy, forged through adversity and tested by manipulation, had become a blueprint for enduring authority, demonstrating that patience, intelligence, and strategic insight could overcome even the most sophisticated attempts at subversion. While the immediate threats were contained, Evelyn's awareness of potential external vulnerabilities ensured that her vigilance remained constant. The balance of power, while currently favorable, required ongoing monitoring, adaptive strategy, and the continual assessment of risk to preserve both her authority and her family's security. Her triumph was therefore simultaneously a conclusion and a new beginning. A position of influence secured, a legacy fortified, yet a constant awareness maintained that the preservation of power demands continuous observation, foresight, and strategic action. Evelyn's journey from humiliation to empowerment exemplified the transformative potential of deliberate, patient, and insightful strategy. By navigating complex relational, corporate, and psychological landscapes with precision, she had turned vulnerability into authority, marginalization into influence, and risk into enduring control. The Whitmore Empire, once teetering under hidden manipulations, was now anchored in structures designed for stability, resilience, and justice, guided by a leader who had proven both unflinching in adversity and brilliant in execution. Her ultimate observation of her child, the embodiment of continuity and hope, underscored the personal dimension of her strategic victories, linking familial security with corporate authority in a seamless framework of foresight and ethical power. Evelyn had not merely reclaimed authority. She had redefined it, establishing a legacy in which resilience, strategic intelligence, and foresight were inseparable from power. Her ascent illustrated that true influence is cultivated through observation, patience, precision, and the judicious use of insight, rather than mere wealth, title, or intimidation. While the immediate conflicts were resolved, Evelyn remained vigilant, recognizing that the dynamic nature of power and influence ensures that no victory is ever permanent without continued diligence. Her legacy was therefore both triumphant and proactive, a structure in which authority, security, and justice coexist, prepared to withstand the unforeseen challenges of a future that is as uncertain as it is consequential. Although the immediate threats have been neutralized and the Whitmore legacy secured, Evelyn remains vigilant, aware that true power demands constant awareness, and that even after triumph, some battles, like shadows at the edge of light, are never fully over. As you've seen, Evelyn turned betrayal and humiliation into strategy, patience, and ultimate power. Every calculated choice she made shaped the empire and protected her child's future. If her journey inspired you or made you think about what it really takes to overcome betrayal, support her story by liking, sharing, and subscribing, so more people can witness how resilience and clever strategy can change everything. Every click helps keep her story alive and ensures you won't miss the next twist in high-stakes battles like this.